As you know, this issue of a constitutional convention is actually a very live one. As mentioned, the Idaho House of Representatives has introduced what's called House Concurrent Resolution 32, a copy of which is on the back table there. And it is a proposal to ask Congress to call a convention of the states to consider proposed amendments to the U.S. Constitution. And it's, if it does pass, then Idaho will get in line with a large number of other states that have enacted resolutions calling on Congress to call a convention of the states to amend the U.S. Constitution. So I thought it would be useful to divide my presentation into two parts. And in the first part, I'll explain what the U.S. Constitution says, and perhaps more importantly, what it does not say about the calling of a constitutional convention. And then in the second part, I'll discuss the current proposed concurrent resolution that's been introduced in the Idaho legislature. And I hope to show that there are good reasons to be concerned about the general prospect of having Congress call a constitutional convention, and also to be concerned specifically about the proposed concurrent resolution that's been introduced in the Idaho House of Representatives. So to begin with the first part, like most constitutions, the U.S. Constitution includes a provision describing how that document can be amended. And the process for amending the U.S. Constitution is in Article 5 of the Constitution. And I'm happy to see that there are plenty of pocket-sized constitutions in the back. You can grab one whenever the spirit moves you. And I'm going to be talking about Article 5 a lot, and that's what the reference is to, Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution. Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution prescribes two methods for amending the U.S. Constitution. One method is for Congress itself to propose amendments. Now, for Congress to propose an amendment to the Constitution, 2/3 of each House must agree to the text of the proposed amendment. That amendment, once passed by 2/3 of each House of Representatives and the Senate, is then sent to the states, 3/4 of which must ratify the proposed amendment for it to become effective. So 3/4 of the state that's needed for ratification means today 38 states would have to ratify the proposed amendment for it to take effect. Now, this method of amending the Constitution, where Congress is the one who proposes the amendment, has actually been used for all of the amendments that have occurred so far to the U.S. Constitution, the 27 amendments. The other method for amending the Constitution, and it is the subject of tonight's presentation, is known as a Convention of the States. And under this Convention of the States method, Article 5 says, quote, on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the states, today that would be 34 states, Congress shall call a convention for proposing amendments, end quote. So here the process is that at least 2/3 of the state, at least 34 states, have to ask Congress to call a convention for proposing amendments. And if the requisite number applies, Congress shall call a convention where each of the states is represented. And then for amendments proposed by a convention of states to become effective, just as is true of amendments proposed by Congress, at least 3/4 of the state, again 38 states, must ratify them. Now, Article 5 also addresses the ratification process. It says that a proposed amendment can be ratified either by the legislature of a state or by a convention in each state, quote, now, as the one or the other mode of ratification may be proposed by the Congress. So, having described the relevant provision in the Constitution for calling a convention of the states, let me turn to both what is clear and what is unclear about Article 5 that I think we should be concerned about. First, it is clear that for purposes of getting Congress to call a convention of the states, and for purposes of having proposed amendments ratified, the number that counts, as I've already suggested, is the number of states, not the number of people. Right? And this makes it possible for a convention of the states to be called and for the amendments proposed by that convention to be ratified by less than a majority of the U.S. population. So remember, it takes 34 states to compel Congress to call a convention. Now, by my calculations, the 34 least populous states account for only 31% of the U.S. population. So in theory, therefore, Congress could be compelled to call a convention that was supported by less than 1/3 of the population. Now, obviously, this is very rough math, right? Because when we talk about population, we include people who are too young to vote and that kind of thing. But it gives you an idea of how this process works. It is not a purely popular democratic process. Now, so as I mentioned, it's possible the 34 states needed to require Congress to call a convention account for only 31% of the population. Recall it takes 38 states to ratify a proposed amendment. Again, by my calculations, the 38 least populous states account for only about 40% of the population. So in theory, a proposed amendment to the U.S. Constitution could be ratified by states representing well under half of the population. Of course, it's highly unlikely that the least populous states would vote as a bloc, and that the most populous states would vote as a bloc. But it is certainly of concern that the numbers that matter for purposes of ratifying the proposed Constitution are the numbers of states rather than the numbers of people. And when you think about it, we are a country that believes very much in the one person, one vote principle. And the process for amending the Constitution really does not adhere to that one person, one vote principle. Another thing that is clear about Article 5, and that can reasonably cause concern, is the method of ratifying proposed amendments. Assume we have a convention of the states and it then proposes amendments. Article 5 says that proposed amendments are to be ratified in each state either by the state legislatures or a ratifying convention in each state, and Congress decides which. So once again, the ratification of a proposed amendment that is supposed to occur in each state is not put up to a popular vote. It is up to either the state legislature or a state convention. Now, the prospect of a state legislature deciding whether or not to ratify a proposed amendment is concerning, in my view, for at least two reasons. Number one, a state legislature apparently can act without being subject to veto by the state governor. So one important check on the legislative process is actually missing. And indeed, it seems somewhat odd that a state's governor can, in theory, act as a check on unwise state legislation, but no such check exists on a state legislature's ratification of a U.S. constitutional amendment. Despite the fact that the stakes are so high, there's less of a check on the state legislative process. Beyond that, number two, there's the problem of whether state legislatures are truly representative of their people. I think most of you are familiar with the problem of gerrymandering. And although we would like to think that our state legislatures are representative of the voters, because of partisan gerrymandering, that can't always be assumed. And you have to add to that the problem that in many state legislatures, women and non-whites are unrepresented, not represented in proportion to their population. And that's also true of members in many states of minority religions as well as atheists. Now, Article 5 permits Congress to have states convene conventions in each state to decide on whether to ratify a proposed amendment. But it appears that the membership of these state conventions would be determined by, guess who? the state legislatures. And indeed, Article 5 does not address whether the state legislatures can choose themselves to serve on these state ratifying conventions. And as I'll mention momentarily, in fact, the Idaho proposed concurrent resolution allows for apparently a majority of the delegates to the convention to be sitting members of the Idaho state legislature. So you end up really, the difference between ratification by the legislature and a convention ends up being possibly illusory.